You know that moment when someone tells you you're wasting oxygen and you realize they're absolutely right, just not in the way they think? That's where this story begins, with my mother-in-law's raspy voice cutting through the humid phoenix, air like a rusty blade, telling me I should just stop breathing and save everyone the trouble. What she didn't know was that in 3 hours, I'd be the one controlling whether she could breathe at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Martinez, and at 42, I thought I'd seen every shade of human cruelty. I was wrong. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in July, with me checking my bank account balance while standing in the kitchen of a house that should have been mine, but legally belonged to the woman who spent every waking moment making my life hell. The numbers on my phone screen told a story I'd been living for 3 years. Mortgage payment due in 5 days, utilities past due, and a checking account that looked like it belonged to someone who collected loose change from couch cushions. Meanwhile, the woman sleeping in the master bedroom upstairs, the woman I'd been caring for since her stroke, owned a house worth $800,000 in one of Phoenix's most desirable neighborhoods, and I couldn't even afford to buy groceries without calculating whether I had enough left over for her prescription medications. Margaret Holloway had been my mother-in-law for 15 years, but she'd only been my responsibility for the last 3. Ever since her son David decided that his new life in Seattle with his 25-year-old massage therapist was more important than the woman who'd raised him. That's when I became the designated caregiver, the one who moved into the guest room of the house I'd been paying the mortgage on since David left, the one who scheduled doctor's appointments and managed medications and pretended not to notice. When Margaret told her bridge club friends that I was a gold-digging Mexican who'd trapped her poor son into marriage. For the record, I'm half Puerto Rican and half Irish. I have a master's degree in social work. And I'd been supporting David's dreams of becoming a successful contractor for 10 years before he decided that success meant abandoning his responsibilities. But Margaret had never let facts interfere with her narrative about me, and now that David was gone, I'd become the sole target of 30 years of accumulated resentment she'd harbored about her son's choices. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was keeping her alive while she slowly killed me with her constant criticism, her impossible demands, and her absolute refusal to acknowledge that I was hemorrhaging money to maintain the lifestyle she insisted she deserved. Every month, I paid the mortgage on a house I'd never inherit, bought groceries for a woman who complained about every meal I prepared, and drove her to appointments in a car that was one transmission failure away from leaving us, both stranded. But it was the breathing comments that really got to me. Margaret had developed this charming habit of telling me I was wasting oxygen whenever she was particularly displeased with something I'd done, which was essentially every day. Burned her toast? Wasting oxygen. Suggested she might benefit from physical therapy? Wasting oxygen. Asked if she'd considered contributing to the household expenses since she received a substantial Social Security check every month? Oh, that was definitely wasting oxygen. Usually followed by a lecture about how ungrateful I was to be living in her house rent-free, as if I hadn't been paying every single bill for 3 years straight. The morning everything changed started, with me discovering that Margaret had been hiding mail again. I found the stack of unopened envelopes stuffed behind her jewelry box while I was helping her organize her medications. Envelopes that included a property tax notice, a homeowner's insurance renewal, and what looked like correspondence from her attorney. This wasn't the first time I'd found hidden mail, but it was the first time the mail seemed specifically designed to keep me in the dark about the house's financial status. I brought the stack downstairs to where Margaret was sitting in her recliner, the oxygen concentrator humming beside her like a mechanical pet. Her breathing had gotten worse over the past few months, and her doctor had prescribed supplemental oxygen for 12 hours a day, though Margaret frequently forgot to use it when she wanted to make some dramatic point about her suffering. "Margaret," I said, keeping my voice level despite the frustration building in my chest, "I found these letters upstairs. They're past due notices for the property taxes and insurance. We need to talk about this." She looked up from her morning talk show with the expression of someone who'd been asked to solve complex mathematical equations instead of having a simple conversation about household finances. "Those aren't your concerns, Sarah. This is my house, and I'll handle my own affairs." "Your affairs that I'm paying for," I reminded her, setting the mail on the coffee table within her reach. "Margaret, I've been covering the mortgage, utilities, groceries, and your medications for 3 years. If there are other expenses I need to know about, we need to discuss them." That's when she said it, the words that would echo in my mind for hours afterward. "You're wasting oxygen just like you're wasting my money. If you don't like the arrangement, you're free to leave. Of course, you'd have nowhere to go, would you? David made it very clear that you're not his problem anymore." The oxygen concentrator continued its steady rhythm beside her chair, a $10,000 machine that her insurance had paid for, delivering the breath she needed to survive while she told me I didn't deserve to breathe at all. The machine that I'd spent 2 days researching, 3 hours on the phone with insurance companies to approve, and an entire afternoon waiting for the delivery technicians to install and calibrate properly. I stared at her for a long moment, watching the thin plastic tubes that ran from the machine to her nose, carrying the concentrated oxygen that kept her blood oxygen levels stable. She'd been using it for 6 months now, completely dependent on it for any kind of physical exertion, increasingly reliant on it even for rest. Her pulmonologist had been very clear about the importance of compliance with the oxygen therapy, especially given her COPD diagnosis and the damage to her lungs from 40 years of smoking. "You're right," I said finally, and she looked surprised by my agreement. "I am wasting oxygen, but not in the way you think." I picked up the mail and walked back to the kitchen, leaving her to her talk show and her machine. But something had shifted in that moment, some fundamental understanding of exactly how much power I actually held in this situation. Margaret could own the house, could hold the deed and make all the decisions about the property, but she couldn't live in it without me. More importantly, she couldn't live at all without the infrastructure I'd built around her care, the network of doctors and pharmacies and insurance authorizations that kept her functional. The first call I made was to her pulmonologist's office. I'd been the one to establish her as a patient there, the one who attended every appointment and asked all the questions and managed her treatment plan. I was listed as her emergency contact and authorized to discuss her care, a privilege Margaret had granted me back when she needed someone to handle the complexity of her medical needs. "Hi, this is Sarah Martinez calling about Margaret Holloway," I said when the nurse picked up. "I need to discuss some concerns about her oxygen therapy compliance and some changes to her living situation." The nurse, Janet, knew me well from our monthly visits. "Of course, Sarah. What's going on?" "Margaret is going to be transitioning to a different care arrangement," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I need to understand the process for transferring her oxygen equipment and prescriptions to a new address, and what kind of oversight she'll need during the transition." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Is she moving to a care facility? Because her current oxygen setup is really designed for a stable home environment with consistent oversight." "That's what we're working out," I said. "Can you tell me what would happen if she missed her scheduled maintenance appointments for the concentrator? Or if there were interruptions in her compliance with the 12-hour daily requirement?" Janet's voice became more serious. "Sarah, you know how important the oxygen therapy is for Margaret's condition. Interruptions in treatment could lead to serious complications, increased shortness of breath, cardiac stress, potentially life-threatening episodes if her blood oxygen levels drop too low. The concentrator also requires regular maintenance and filter changes to function properly. Without consistent oversight, the equipment could malfunction or become unsafe. And if she were to refuse treatment or become non-compliant, that would be a very serious medical decision that would need to be discussed with Dr. Rahman immediately. Non-compliance with prescribed oxygen therapy for a patient with Margaret's level of COPD could result in rapid deterioration of her condition. I thanked Janet and hung up, feeling the first stirrings of a plan forming in my mind. The second call I made was to Margaret's attorney, whose name I'd found on one of the letters she'd been hiding. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Good morning, this is Sarah Martinez," I said when the receptionist put me through. "I'm calling regarding Margaret Holloway. I'm her primary caregiver, and I need to discuss some urgent matters related to her estate planning and living arrangements." Mr. Peterson, Margaret's attorney, had a voice like gravel mixed with expensive whiskey. "Mrs. Martinez, yes. Margaret has mentioned you. How can I help you?" "I need to understand Margaret's wishes regarding her care if she becomes unable to make decisions for herself, and I need to know what provisions have been made for her ongoing care expenses." "Well, that's a bit complex," Peterson said slowly. "Margaret has been very specific about maintaining her independence and her control over her assets. She's resistant to any arrangements that might limit her autonomy." "What about the house? If something were to happen to Margaret, what are the arrangements for the property?" There was a long pause. "I'm not sure I can discuss the details of Margaret's estate planning with you without her explicit consent. But I can tell you that she's been very concerned about ensuring that her assets are protected and distributed according to her wishes." "Protected from whom?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I think you'd need to have that conversation with Margaret directly." The third call I made was to the mortgage company. As the person who'd been making payments for 3 years, I had access to the account information, and what I learned made my blood pressure spike to dangerous levels. Margaret's house was nearly paid off. Not because of my mortgage payments, but because David had taken out a substantial loan against the property before he left for Seattle. A loan that Margaret had apparently agreed to, and that had been used to pay down the original mortgage. My monthly payments hadn't been covering a traditional mortgage at all. They'd been covering the interest and fees on a private loan that David had arranged, a loan that Margaret could call due at any time. In other words, I'd been paying David rent on his mother's house while thinking I was building equity, or at least maintaining a stable living situation. Margaret owned the house free and clear except for David's loan, which meant she could evict me tomorrow if she chose to, and I'd have no legal recourse and no claim to any of the money I'd invested in the property. The fourth call I made was to David himself. It was the first time I'd spoken to my ex-husband in 8 months, and his voice sounded exactly the same: confident, dismissive, and completely uninterested in taking responsibility for anything he'd left behind. "Sarah," he said when he picked up, and I could hear traffic in the background. "This is unexpected. Is Mom okay?" "Your mother is fine, David, but I just found out about the loan arrangement you made before you left, and I need you to explain to me how you thought this was acceptable." "Look, Mom needed the cash flow, and you needed a place to live. It worked out for everyone. It worked out for you and Margaret. I've been paying rent on a house I thought I was buying, taking care of a woman who treats me like hired help, and covering expenses for someone who's been lying to me about her financial situation for 3 years. Mom's not lying about anything. She owns the house, you live there, you pay expenses. It's a pretty straightforward arrangement." "The arrangement where you get paid and I get nothing? That's straightforward theft, David." His voice hardened. "You're living in an $800,000 house in Scottsdale, Sarah. You're not exactly suffering. I'm living in a house I can't afford while taking care of your mother because you abandoned your responsibilities. And now I find out that the whole time, you've been profiting from my situation while I go deeper into debt. If you don't like the arrangement, you can leave. Mom's perfectly capable of taking care of herself." That was David's first lie, though not his biggest one. Margaret hadn't been capable of taking care of herself since her stroke, and David knew it. She needed help with medication management, transportation to appointments, meal preparation, and increasingly, assistance with basic daily activities. Her oxygen dependence had made her even more reliant on consistent care, and her cognitive function had been declining slowly but noticeably over the past year. But David's casual dismissal of my situation, his complete lack of acknowledgement of what I'd sacrificed to keep his mother safe and comfortable, crystallized something for me. I'd been thinking like a victim, like someone who had to accept whatever arrangement other people made for my life. I'd forgotten that I had power, too, and that the person who controlled the day-to-day reality of Margaret's life wasn't David or Margaret herself. It was me. The fifth call I made was back to Margaret's pulmonologist, but this time I asked to speak to Dr. Rahman directly. Dr. Rahman, this is Sarah Martinez, Margaret Holloway's caregiver. I need to schedule an urgent appointment to discuss Margaret's care plan and some concerns about her living situation. Of course, Sarah. Is Margaret experiencing any acute symptoms? Not yet, I said. But her family situation is changing rapidly, and I need to make sure we have appropriate arrangements in place for her oxygen therapy and overall care management. Can you bring her in tomorrow morning? I have an opening at 10. Actually, I need to meet with you privately first to discuss some concerns about compliance and oversight. Margaret has been making some decisions that could impact her treatment, and I want to make sure I understand the medical implications before we involve her in the conversation. Dr. Rahman agreed to see me that afternoon, and I spent the rest of the morning researching oxygen concentrators, COPD management, and the legal responsibilities of caregivers in Arizona. What I learned was enlightening and frankly terrifying in terms of the liability I'd been unknowingly assuming. As Margaret's primary caregiver, I was legally responsible for ensuring her medical compliance and safety. If something happened to her because of negligence in her care management, I could face criminal charges as well as civil liability. But the flip side of that responsibility was authority. I had the legal right to make decisions about her care environment and treatment compliance, especially given her increasing cognitive decline and her tendency to make medically dangerous choices. More importantly, I learned that oxygen concentrators require specific environmental conditions to function safely. They need regular maintenance, proper ventilation, and protection from heat and humidity. Arizona's summer temperatures, combined with an unreliable air conditioning system in an old house, could easily create conditions that would make the equipment malfunction or become dangerous to operate. Margaret's insurance would cover the cost of relocating her oxygen equipment, but only to an approved care facility or to a home environment that met specific safety and oversight requirements. A caregiver who was planning to leave would be required to ensure continuity of care, which meant either arranging for replacement caregiving services or facilitating Margaret's transition to an appropriate care facility. By the time I left for my appointment with Dr. Rahman, I had a plan. Not a revenge plan exactly, but a consequences plan. Margaret wanted to treat me like hired help who could be dismissed at will, and David wanted to profit from my unpaid labor while taking no responsibility for his mother's actual needs. Fine. They could have exactly what they'd asked for, but they'd get it on my terms, and in accordance with the legal and medical requirements they'd been ignoring. Dr. Rahman's office was in a medical complex near Scottsdale Healthcare, and the afternoon heat was brutal even for July in Phoenix. I sat in my car for a few minutes before going in, letting the air conditioning fight against the 115-degree temperature while I organized my thoughts and documents. The conversation with Dr. Rahman was enlightening in ways I hadn't expected. Margaret's condition was worse than she'd been admitting, and her non-compliance with treatment recommendations was more dangerous than I'd realized. Margaret's COPD has progressed significantly since her initial diagnosis, Dr. Rahman explained, reviewing her chart on his computer screen. Her lung function tests show continued deterioration, and her oxygen saturation levels have been concerning, even with the supplemental oxygen therapy. How concerning? Concerning enough that I've been recommending more intensive monitoring and considering whether she needs to transition to continuous oxygen rather than just 12 hours a day. But Margaret has been resistant to increasing her treatment compliance, and she's missed her last 2 scheduled appointments. I felt a chill despite the air conditioning. She told me those appointments were canceled because of scheduling conflicts. No, she called and canceled them herself. She said she was feeling better and didn't think she needed to be seen as frequently. Dr. Rahman looked at me seriously. Sarah, Margaret's condition requires consistent medical oversight. COPD is a progressive disease, and at her stage, any interruption in treatment or monitoring could result in rapid decline or acute respiratory crisis. What would happen if she suddenly didn't have access to her oxygen concentrator? That would be a medical emergency. Depending on her current oxygen levels and the ambient air quality, she could experience severe shortness of breath, chest pain, confusion, and potentially respiratory failure within hours. It's not something that should ever happen without immediate medical intervention. And if she were in a situation where her care environment became unsafe or unsuitable for managing her condition? Dr. Rahman leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. Sarah, is there something specific you're concerned about? Is Margaret's living situation changing? Yes, I said. I'm planning to move out of Margaret's house, and I need to understand what kind of care arrangements need to be in place before I can do that responsibly. When are you planning to move? Soon, potentially within the next few weeks. Has Margaret arranged for alternative caregiving support? Not yet. She's been resistant to the idea that she needs ongoing assistance. Dr. Rahman was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him thinking through the implications. Sarah, based on Margaret's current condition and care needs, I don't think she can safely live alone, especially with her oxygen dependence and medication management requirements. If you're planning to leave, we need to have a very serious conversation with Margaret about her options. What are her options? Hiring professional in-home care, which can be extremely expensive and difficult to coordinate, moving in with family members who can provide appropriate oversight, or transitioning to an assisted living facility that specializes in respiratory care. And if she refuses all of those options, then I'd be obligated to document her refusal of medically necessary care and potentially involve adult protective services if I believed she was making decisions that put her at serious risk of harm. Perfect. I scheduled a joint appointment for Margaret and myself for the following week, giving me time to set the other pieces of my plan in motion. Dr. Rahman was going to explain to Margaret exactly what level of care she needed, and I was going to be there to ensure she understood her options clearly. The drive home from Dr. Rahman's office took me through Old Town Scottsdale, past the art galleries and restaurants where David and I used to spend our Friday nights back when we were still pretending our marriage was fixable. The memories felt like they belonged to someone else, some naive woman who'd believed that love and loyalty were enough to build a life on. That woman had been wrong about a lot of things, but she'd been particularly wrong about the difference between being needed and being valued. Margaret needed me desperately, needed my income, my labor, my knowledge of her medical requirements, and my willingness to sacrifice my own well-being for her comfort. But she didn't value me at all, and she'd made that crystal clear in 1,000 small cruelties over the past 3 years. David needed me too, needed me to take responsibility for the mother he'd abandoned and the financial obligations he'd walked away from. But he didn't value me either, saw me as a convenient solution to a problem he didn't want to deal with, rather than as a person with my own needs and rights. Well, they were about to learn the difference between being needed and being valued, and they were going to learn it in the most educational way possible. I stopped at Target on the way home and bought a small notebook, the kind with a wire spiral binding that would fit easily in my purse. I was going to start documenting everything, every conversation, every medical appointment, every financial transaction, every instance of Margaret's non-compliance with medical recommendations. If this situation was going to end badly, and I was increasingly certain it was, I wanted a detailed record of exactly how we'd gotten there and who was responsible for what. Margaret was napping when I got home, the oxygen concentrator humming beside her recliner like a mechanical guardian angel. The sound had become background noise over the past months, as constant and unremarkable as the air conditioning or the refrigerator. But now I listened to it with new awareness. $10,000 worth of equipment, keeping Margaret alive 24 hours a day, completely dependent on electricity and regular maintenance, and my willingness to manage the complexity of her care. I made dinner quietly, grilled chicken, and vegetables that Margaret would complain about while eating every bite, and used the time to think through the logistics of what I was planning. The beautiful thing about consequences, as opposed to revenge, was that they didn't require any deception or manipulation on my part. I just had to stop protecting people from the results of their own choices and let reality take its course. Margaret wanted me to leave? Fine. I'd leave. But I'd leave responsibly, following all the legal and medical requirements for ensuring continuity of care for a dependent adult. If Margaret chose to refuse the care arrangements that her condition required, that would be her choice, and she'd face the consequences of that choice just like any other adult. David wanted to profit from my unpaid labor while taking no responsibility for his mother's needs? Fine. He could take full responsibility for both the profit and the needs, including the legal liability for Margaret's care and safety. The mortgage company wanted their monthly payments? They could collect them from the person who actually owned the house and had been receiving the benefit of my payments for 3 years. But first, I had some research to do and some phone calls to make. Margaret woke up while I was setting the table, complaining about the smell of the food and the temperature of the house, and the volume of the television that I hadn't turned on yet. I nodded and agreed and served her dinner, the same routine we'd followed for 3 years. But now it felt different. Now it felt like I was watching someone dig their own grave one spoonful at a time. The next morning brought Margaret's complaints about her breakfast before I'd even finished making it. The toast was too dark, the coffee too weak, and the orange juice had pulp in it even though she'd been drinking the same brand for months without comment. I listened to her litany of dissatisfaction while mentally calculating how many more mornings I'd have to endure this routine. And another thing, Margaret continued, stabbing at her scrambled eggs with unnecessary force. That oxygen machine is too loud. It kept me awake half the night. Can't you do something about it? I looked at the concentrator humming quietly in the corner, no louder than a desktop computer, providing the breath that kept her alive. The machine is functioning normally, Margaret. If it seems louder than usual, that might indicate you need to have your hearing checked at your next appointment. My hearing is fine. The machine is loud, and I don't like having it in my bedroom. This was interesting. Margaret had been complaining about various aspects of her medical equipment for weeks, but this was the first time she'd suggested removing it from her sleeping area. Where would you like to put it? I don't want it anywhere. The whole house smells like a hospital now, and I'm tired of being tethered to that thing like some kind of invalid. The oxygen therapy isn't optional, Margaret. Dr. Rahman prescribed it because your blood oxygen levels drop to dangerous levels without it. Dr. Rahman says a lot of things. Doesn't mean I have to listen to all of them. I set down my coffee cup and looked at her directly. Actually, it does mean you have to listen to them if you want to stay healthy. And if you want me to continue managing your care. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. What's that supposed to mean? It means that as your caregiver, I have a responsibility to ensure you're following your prescribed treatment plan. If you're refusing medical treatment that your doctor considers essential, then I need to document that refusal and discuss it with your medical team. You don't have the right to discuss my medical information with anyone. I have exactly the rights you gave me when you signed the HIPAA authorization forms allowing me to speak with your doctors and manage your care. Rights you were happy to give me when you needed someone to handle the complexity of your medical needs. Margaret's face flushed red, a color that looked particularly alarming given her respiratory condition. You're threatening me. I'm explaining the legal requirements of the caregiving role you've insisted I fill. If you don't want me managing your medical care, that's your choice, but you'll need to make alternative arrangements. She stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to determine whether I was bluffing. I wasn't. The research I'd done the night before had been very thorough, and I'd learned that caregivers who failed to ensure medical compliance for dependent adults could face serious legal consequences. But I'd also learned that I had more authority than I'd realized to make decisions about Margaret's care environment and treatment adherence. "Fine," she said finally, "but I don't want to hear any more lectures about what I should and shouldn't do in my own house. We need to talk about the house. What about it? I spoke with your attorney yesterday, and I need some clarification about the financial arrangements here." Margaret's fork clattered against her plate. "You had no right to call Peterson." I had every right to understand the legal implications of the living situation I've been funding for 3 years. Did you know that I've been paying rent to David this whole time instead of building equity or contributing to an actual mortgage? The financial arrangements of this household are none of your business. The financial arrangements I've been paying for are absolutely my business. Margaret, I've spent nearly $60,000 over the last 3 years thinking I was contributing to household expenses and possibly building some kind of stake in the property. Instead, I've been paying your son rent while covering all the actual expenses of maintaining the house. David needed the income, and you needed a place to live. Everyone benefited. David benefited. You benefited. I subsidized both of your lifestyles while thinking I was securing my own housing situation. Margaret pushed her plate away, most of her breakfast uneaten. "If you don't like the arrangement, you're welcome to leave. I never asked you to stay here. Actually, you did. Repeatedly. Every time you had a medical crisis, every time you needed someone to drive you to appointments, every time you ran out of medication or couldn't figure out how to work the television remote or got confused about your insurance coverage. You asked me to stay, and I stayed because I thought we were family. We're not family anymore." David made that very clear when he filed for divorce. The words hit exactly as she'd intended them to. A reminder that my connection to this house and this woman was entirely contingent on the goodwill of people who'd already demonstrated they had none. But instead of the hurt and insecurity Margaret was expecting, I felt something else entirely. Relief. "You're absolutely right," I said. "We're not family, which means I don't owe you the kind of unconditional sacrifice that family members make for each other. What I owe you is exactly what you're paying for, which is professional caregiving services." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about treating our arrangement like the business relationship it actually is. You want me to continue managing your medical care, maintaining this house, and covering your daily expenses? Fine, but you're going to pay me for those services at the market rate." Margaret's breathing became more labored, and I could see her reaching for the portable oxygen tank she kept beside her chair for moments when the concentrator wasn't sufficient. "You can't charge me for things you've been doing voluntarily." "I've been doing them voluntarily because I thought I was part of your family and because I thought I had a stake in maintaining this household. Now that I understand this is a business arrangement, we need to formalize the terms." I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app where I'd been researching overnight. Professional in-home care for someone with your medical needs runs between $25 and $40 per hour, depending on the level of medical oversight required. Given that you need medication management, transportation to appointments, meal preparation, and supervision of your oxygen therapy, you'd be looking at the higher end of that range. That's ridiculous. I'm not paying you $40 an hour to live in my house. Then you'll need to make alternative arrangements for your care. But those arrangements will need to meet the medical requirements that Dr. Rahman has outlined for your condition. I stood up and began clearing the breakfast dishes, giving Margaret time to process what I'd just told her. She was smart enough to understand the implications, even if she didn't want to acknowledge them. Professional caregivers were expensive, difficult to find, and unlikely to tolerate the kind of emotional abuse that Margaret considered normal communication. Care facilities were even more expensive, and would require her to follow medical protocols whether she liked them or not. "You're being unreasonable," she said finally. "I'm being realistic. Margaret, you have a progressive medical condition that requires consistent oversight and support. I've been providing that support for 3 years while paying for the privilege of doing so. That arrangement isn't sustainable, and it's not fair. Life isn't fair, Sarah. You should have learned that by now. You're absolutely right. Life isn't fair, but that doesn't mean I have to keep accepting arrangements that are deliberately designed to exploit me." I finished loading the dishwasher and turned to face her. "I'm going to give you some time to think about what kind of care arrangement you want going forward. But I need you to understand that the current situation can't continue. Are you threatening to abandon me?" "I'm telling you that I'm going to stop subsidizing a living arrangement that benefits everyone except me. If you want me to continue as your caregiver, we need to establish a professional relationship with appropriate compensation. If you prefer to make other arrangements, I'll help you transition to alternative care, but I won't continue the current setup." Margaret's face had gone pale, and she was gripping the arms of her recliner so tightly her knuckles were white. "How long are you giving me to decide?" 2 weeks. That should be enough time for you to research your options and make arrangements. 2 weeks isn't enough time to find quality care providers. Then you might want to start making some phone calls today. I left her sitting in her recliner with her oxygen concentrator humming beside her and went upstairs to my room to continue the phone calls I'd started the day before. The first call was to a home care agency in Scottsdale that specialized in medical support for elderly clients. "Good morning, this is Sunshine Home Care. How can I help you?" "Hi, I'm calling to get information about in-home care services for someone with COPD who requires oxygen therapy and medication management." "Of course. Can you tell me a little bit about the level of care needed?" I spent 20 minutes detailing Margaret's condition, her daily care requirements, and her tendency toward non-compliance with medical recommendations. The case manager, whose name was Linda, took detailed notes and asked questions that made it clear she understood the complexity of what Margaret would need. "Based on what you're describing," Linda said finally, "your mother-in-law would need what we call Level 3 care, which includes medical oversight, medication management, and respiratory support. Our rate for that level of care is $38 per hour." "And how many hours per day would you recommend for someone with her needs?" "For someone who's oxygen dependent and has compliance issues, I'd recommend a minimum of 12 hours of direct care per day, with check-in visits during the remaining hours. That would run approximately $450 per day." I did the quick math in my head. $13,000 per month, not including the cost of medications, medical equipment maintenance, and emergency services. Margaret's Social Security check was $2,200 per month. What if the client is resistant to following medical protocols or becomes verbally abusive toward care providers? Linda's tone became more cautious. "We do have experience with challenging clients, but our staff are trained professionals who don't tolerate abuse. If a client becomes consistently difficult or creates an unsafe working environment, we reserve the right to terminate services." "How much notice would you typically give in that situation?" 72 hours, unless there's an immediate safety concern, in which case we'd remove our staff immediately and contact appropriate authorities." "Perfect." I thanked Linda and hung up, then immediately called 2 other home care agencies to get comparable quotes. The prices were remarkably consistent, ranging from $35 to $42 per hour for the level of care Margaret would require. The second call I made was to Paradise Valley Assisted Living, a facility about 15 minutes from Margaret's house that specialized in respiratory care. The marketing director, a woman named Carol, was happy to discuss their services and pricing. "We have several residents with COPD and oxygen dependence," Carol explained. "Our nursing staff are specially trained in respiratory care, and we have backup oxygen systems and emergency protocols in place." What would you need from a potential resident in terms of medical documentation and assessment? We'd need a comprehensive medical evaluation from their primary care physician and their pulmonologist, documentation of their current medications and treatment plans, and a behavioral assessment to ensure they'd be a good fit for our community environment. What if someone has a history of non-compliance with medical recommendations? That would be a concern. We require residents to follow their prescribed treatment plans, and we have protocols for managing non-compliance. Residents who consistently refuse medical treatment or create disruptions in the community environment may be asked to seek care elsewhere. And your monthly rates? For someone requiring respiratory care and medication management, our monthly rate would be approximately $8,000, not including additional medical services or specialized equipment. I spent another hour researching senior living facilities, Medicare coverage for long-term care, and the legal process for determining when someone was no longer capable of making their own medical decisions. What I learned was enlightening and slightly terrifying. Margaret's Medicare coverage would pay for some home care services, but only if they were medically necessary and prescribed by a physician. Her supplemental insurance might cover additional costs, but there would still be substantial out-of-pocket expenses. More importantly, if Margaret's condition deteriorated to the point where she required continuous medical oversight, she could be declared medically incompetent, and decision-making authority could be transferred to a designated family member or court-appointed guardian. Since David had moved to Seattle and shown no interest in managing his mother's care, and since I was currently her designated emergency contact and medical proxy, I could potentially become her legal guardian if her condition warranted it. That would give me complete authority over her medical care, living arrangements, and financial decisions. I wasn't sure I wanted that level of responsibility, but it was useful information to have. The third call I made was to Margaret's homeowners insurance company. As the person who'd been paying the premiums for 3 years, I was listed as an authorized contact on the policy, and I needed to understand what kind of coverage was in place for medical equipment and liability issues. Ms. Martinez, yes, I see you're listed as the primary contact for policy questions, the customer service representative said. How can I help you today? I need to understand what's covered if there are problems with medical equipment in the home, and what kind of liability coverage is in place for caregiving situations. Let me pull up the policy details. I see you have standard homeowners coverage with a personal liability rider. Medical equipment like oxygen concentrators would be covered for fire or theft, but mechanical failures would be the responsibility of the equipment provider or the patient's medical insurance. What about liability if someone is injured while providing care in the home? That would depend on the circumstances. If it's a family member providing informal care, there might not be coverage. If it's a professional care provider, they should have their own liability insurance. If someone is injured due to unsafe conditions in the home, that could potentially be covered under the personal liability portion of the policy. What constitutes unsafe conditions? Things like inadequate lighting, faulty electrical systems, obstructed pathways, or environmental hazards that could cause falls or other injuries. I thought about Margaret's house, with its outdated electrical system, uneven floors, and the general clutter that had accumulated over the years. What if the homeowner refuses to address safety issues that are identified by medical professionals? That could potentially void coverage if an injury occurs as a result of known hazards that weren't addressed. Interesting. I thanked the representative and hung up, then spent some time walking through Margaret's house with new eyes, noting potential safety issues that could impact her ability to live independently. The list was longer than I'd expected. The stairs to the second floor had a loose handrail and uneven risers. The bathroom had no grab bars and a slippery tile floor. The kitchen had poor lighting and appliances that were showing their age. The fee. Oxygen concentrator was positioned near a heating vent, which wasn't ideal for the equipment's functioning. There were throw rugs throughout the house that could easily cause falls, and the overall lighting was insufficient for someone with aging. Eyes and potential medication-related vision changes. Any professional care provider would immediately identify these issues as safety concerns that needed to be addressed before they could provide services in the home. The cost of making the necessary modifications would be substantial, and the disruption to Margaret's routine would be significant. I made a detailed list of all the safety issues I could identify, took photos of the most obvious problems, and researched the cost of addressing each concern. By the time I finished, I estimated that making Margaret's house safe for professional in-home care would cost at least $15,000, not including ongoing maintenance and updates. Margaret was napping when I went back downstairs, her breathing audible even over the hum of the oxygen concentrator. She looked smaller and frailer than usual, and for a moment I felt a pang of something that might have been guilt or sympathy. Then I remembered her telling me I was wasting oxygen, and the feeling passed. I spent the afternoon researching Arizona's Adult Protective Services protocols and the legal requirements for reporting concerns about vulnerable adults. What I learned was that healthcare providers, caregivers, and family members had a legal obligation to report situations where vulnerable adults were at risk of harm due to neglect, abuse, or their own inability to make safe decisions. If Margaret refused appropriate medical care, refused to address safety issues in her home, or refused to accept adequate caregiving support, any of her healthcare providers could be required to report the situation to Adult Protective Services. APS would then conduct an investigation and could potentially seek guardianship or mandatory placement in a care facility if they determined that Margaret was unable to make safe decisions about her own care. The process could take weeks or months, but the end result would be that Margaret's autonomy and control over her living situation would be severely limited. She'd be much better off making her own arrangements for appropriate care than having those arrangements imposed on her by the state. I drafted a letter outlining Margaret's care options, the associated costs, and the timeline for making a decision. I included information about the home modifications that would be necessary for professional in-home care, the requirements for assisted living placement, and the legal obligations for ensuring her safety and medical compliance. The letter was professional, factual, and completely free of emotional appeals or threats. Then I drafted a second letter to David, outlining his legal and financial obligations as Margaret's son and the beneficiary of the loan arrangement that had been funding his lifestyle at my expense. This letter was less diplomatic and much more direct about the consequences of his continued absence from his mother's care situation. Margaret woke up around 4 o'clock, complaining about the heat and asking why I hadn't started dinner yet. I helped her adjust her oxygen levels and brought her a glass of water before sitting down across from her with the letter I'd written. "Margaret, I've researched the options we discussed this morning, and I wanted to go over them with you so you can make an informed decision about your care going forward." She looked at the papers in my hand with suspicion. "What kind of options?" "Professional in-home care, assisted living facilities, and the requirements for each option." I handed her the letter and watched her read through it, her expression becoming more alarmed with each paragraph. "These prices are outrageous," she said finally. "Nobody pays $40 an hour for someone to help around the house." "These aren't prices for help around the house. These are prices for medical care management, oxygen therapy oversight, medication administration, and safety supervision for someone with a progressive respiratory condition. I don't need medical care management. I need someone to help with cooking and cleaning. According to Dr. Rahman, you need much more than that. Your condition requires professional oversight to prevent medical emergencies." Margaret crumpled the letter and threw it on the coffee table. "This is ridiculous. You're trying to scare me into paying you more money. I'm trying to help you understand what your actual care needs are and what it costs to meet those needs professionally. If you prefer to continue with our current arrangement, you can pay me the market rate for the services I'm providing. I'm not paying you anything. You live here rent-free. I live here while paying all the household expenses and providing round-the-clock caregiving services. That's not rent-free, Margaret. That's me subsidizing your lifestyle while working as your unpaid nurse." She reached for her portable oxygen tank, a gesture that had become automatic when she was stressed or angry. "You're being completely unreasonable. I'm being realistic about what it costs to maintain the lifestyle you want while managing the medical condition you have. If my expectations are unreasonable, then you should definitely explore other options." "What other options?" "You've made it clear that everything else is either too expensive or too restrictive. Those are the options available for someone with your medical needs and financial resources. If you don't like any of them, you might want to discuss alternatives with David." "David has his own life to live. He can't be expected to manage my affairs." "David has been profiting from your affairs for 3 years, while taking no responsibility for managing them. Maybe it's time for that to change." Margaret stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to process the implications of what I was saying. She'd spent 3 years treating me like a servant who should be grateful for the opportunity to serve her. And now I was telling her that the servant was quitting unless the terms of employment changed dramatically. "How much time did you say I have to decide?" 2 weeks. That should give you enough time to research your options and make arrangements. "And if I decide I want to keep things the way they are? Then you'll need to start paying me for my services at the professional rate, and we'll need to make the safety modifications to the house that professional care providers require. And if I decide I want you to leave? Then I'll help you transition to alternative care arrangements, but I'll need at least 2 weeks' notice to ensure continuity of your medical management." Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring at the oxygen concentrator as if it held answers to questions she didn't want to ask. Finally, she looked back at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger or contempt, but something that might have been fear. "What if I can't afford any of these options? Then you'll need to discuss financial assistance programs with your social worker, or you'll need to ask David to contribute to your care costs, or you'll need to consider selling the house to fund your care needs." "Sell the house?" "Margaret, this house is worth $800,000. If you sold it and moved to an appropriate care facility, you'd have enough money to cover your expenses for many years." "I'm not selling my house." "Then you'll need to find another way to pay for the care you need." She looked around the living room as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the furniture and decorations and memories that represented 60 years of her life. "This is my home. I understand that. But your home needs to be a place where you can live safely and receive appropriate medical care. If this house can't provide that environment, then you need to consider alternatives. You could make it work. You've been making it work for 3 years. I've been making it work by sacrificing my own financial security and physical health. That's not sustainable, and it's not fair to expect me to continue." Margaret reached for the letter she'd crumpled and smoothed it out on her lap, reading through it again more carefully. "These care facilities, do they allow you to bring your own furniture?" "Some of them do. You'd need to ask about their policies for personal belongings." "And the home care providers, would they let me keep my regular routine?" "Professional care providers work with their clients to maintain as much normalcy as possible, but they also have to follow medical protocols and safety requirements." She folded the letter carefully and set it on the coffee table. "I need to think about this." "Of course, take your time. But remember that you have 2 weeks to make a decision, and some of these options require advanced planning and waiting lists." I got up to start dinner, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and her oxygen concentrator. She didn't speak to me for the rest of the evening, which was actually a relief. The silence gave me time to think through the next steps of my plan and to prepare for the conversations I'd need to have over the next few days. That night, I called David again. This time, I was ready for his dismissive attitude and his attempts to avoid responsibility. "Sarah," he said when he picked up, and I could hear music in the background. Twice in 2 days, this is definitely a record. I wanted to give you an update on your mother's situation and let you know what's going to happen over the next few weeks. What's going to happen is that you're going to keep taking care of Mom like you've been doing, and everyone's going to continue being happy with the arrangement. Actually, that's not what's going to happen. I'm giving Margaret 2 weeks to arrange alternative care. After that, I'll be moving out. The music in the background stopped abruptly. What are you talking about? I'm talking about ending an arrangement that's been financially devastating for me while providing you with income and Margaret with free caregiving services. You can't just abandon Mom. She's dependent on you. She's dependent on professional caregiving services, which she's going to need to pay for just like everyone else in her situation. Sarah, be reasonable. Mom doesn't have the money for professional care. Then she'll need to sell the house to fund her care, or you'll need to contribute to her expenses instead of profiting from them. I can't afford to support Mom financially. I have my own expenses here. Your own expenses that include the monthly payments I've been making on your loan against her house. David, I've been funding your lifestyle while providing free care for your mother. That ends in 2 weeks. There was a long pause. What do you want from me? I want you to take responsibility for your mother's care or for the financial costs of that care. I want you to stop profiting from my unpaid labor. And I want you to understand that if something happens to Margaret because she doesn't have appropriate care, you'll be legally and financially responsible. Nothing's going to happen to Mom. Margaret has advanced COPD and requires oxygen therapy, medication management, and safety supervision. Without appropriate care, she could have a medical emergency that could be life-threatening. Then keep providing the care at the professional rate and with appropriate working conditions. If you want me to continue as Margaret's caregiver, you can pay me $40 an hour for my services. $40 an hour? That's insane. That's the market rate for the level of care your mother requires. If you think it's too expensive, you're welcome to research alternatives. Sarah, you're being completely unreasonable. I'm being realistic about what it costs to provide the level of care your mother needs. You've been getting that care for free while charging me rent to provide it. That arrangement is ending. I hung up before David could respond and spent the rest of the evening researching legal requirements for caregiver notification and documentation. If David tried to claim later that I'd abandoned Margaret without appropriate notice or transition planning, I wanted to have detailed records showing that I'd followed all the proper procedures and given everyone involved adequate time to make alternative arrangements. Margaret was unusually quiet the next morning, picking at her breakfast and avoiding eye contact. She didn't complain about the food or the temperature or the noise level, which was so unusual that I found myself checking to make sure she was feeling all right. "Are you having any breathing difficulties this morning?" I asked, noting that her oxygen saturation levels seemed normal, but her overall energy was low. "I'm fine," she said quietly, "just thinking. About your care options? About a lot of things." She spent most of the morning sitting in her recliner, staring out the window at the desert landscape beyond her backyard. The monsoon season was starting early this year, and the sky had the heavy, threatening look that preceded the afternoon thunderstorms that would bring brief relief from the heat. Around noon, Margaret surprised me by asking if I could drive her to the bank. "Is there something specific you need to take care of?" "I want to look at my accounts and see what my options are." I helped her gather her oxygen portable tank and the paperwork she'd need, and we made the drive to her credit union in careful silence. Margaret had been banking at the same institution for 40 years, and the staff knew her well enough to provide a private office for her to review her financial situation. I waited in the lobby while Margaret met with a financial advisor, watching the desert storm clouds build over the mountains and thinking about the changes that were coming, whether Margaret was ready for them or not. After an hour, she emerged, from the office looking older and more fragile than when she'd gone in. "How did it go?" I asked as I helped her back to the car. "Better than I expected," she said quietly. "And worse." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I have more money than I thought I did, but not enough to maintain my current lifestyle indefinitely." We drove home in silence, and Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon making phone calls. I could hear her talking to what sounded like care facilities and home care agencies, asking questions about services and pricing and availability. She was taking the situation seriously, which was more than I'd expected. That evening, she asked me to sit down with her after dinner. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice more subdued than I'd heard it in years. "About the arrangement we've had, and whether it's been fair to you." I waited for her to continue, not sure what direction this conversation was going to take. "I may not have been as appreciative as I should have been of everything you've done to help me these past few years." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was closer than anything I'd ever heard from Margaret before. "I've been spoiled," she continued. "Having you here to handle everything, not having to worry about the details of running a household or managing my medical care. I got used to it, and I didn't think about what it was costing you. What it was costing me financially, or what it was costing me personally. Both, I suppose." We sat quietly for a moment, listening to the oxygen concentrator and the distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm. "What did you find out today when you talked to the care agencies?" I asked. "That professional care is extremely expensive and that most of the good providers have waiting lists." "And the assisted living facilities?" "Also expensive, and most of them have requirements about medical stability and behavioral compliance that I'm not sure I could meet." "What kind of requirements?" "Following prescribed treatments, being cooperative with staff, not creating disruptions in the community environment." She looked at me meaningfully. "Apparently, I have a reputation for being difficult." Despite everything, I found myself smiling slightly. I can't imagine how they got that impression. Very funny. But Margaret was almost smiling too, which was remarkable given the circumstances. "So, what are you thinking about doing?" "I'm thinking about your offer to continue as my caregiver if I pay you the professional rate." It wasn't exactly an offer, Margaret. It was an explanation of what it would cost to maintain our current arrangement on a professional basis. "Right. Well, I'm thinking about whether that might be the best option among a lot of difficult choices. And I need to understand exactly what the terms would be. What you'd expect from me, what I could expect from you, how we'd handle conflicts or disagreements." This was definitely more serious consideration than I'd expected from Margaret. "If we formalize our arrangement, as a professional caregiving relationship, there would need to be clear boundaries and expectations on both sides. Such as, you'd need to follow your prescribed medical treatments without argument. You'd need to treat me with professional respect, which means no verbal abuse or personal attacks. You'd need to pay me on time and according to our agreed schedule. And you'd need to understand that I'm an employee, not a family member, which means I don't have to tolerate behavior that you wouldn't direct toward any other professional service provider." Margaret considered this carefully. "What would you expect to provide in return?" "Medical care management, transportation to appointments, meal preparation, light housekeeping, medication administration and monitoring, safety supervision, and emergency response. Basically everything I've been providing, but with clear professional boundaries and appropriate compensation." "How much compensation are we talking about?" $38 per hour for 12 hours of direct care per day, which comes to about $15,000 per month. Margaret's eyes widened. $15,000 a month? That's actually below the market rate for the level of care you require. Most agencies would charge more, and they'd require you to make the safety modifications to the house before they'd provide services here. What safety modifications? I pulled out the list I'd made the day before and went through each item, explaining why professional care providers would consider each issue a liability concern. Margaret listened without comment, but I could see her calculating the costs in her head. "This is all very overwhelming," she said finally. "It's the reality of managing a serious medical condition while maintaining independence. If the costs and requirements seem overwhelming, that's because independence for someone in your situation is complicated and expensive. What would you do if you were in my position?" It was the first time Margaret had ever asked for my opinion about anything significant, and I considered my answer carefully. If I were in your position, I'd sell the house and move to a high-quality assisted living facility that specializes in respiratory care. You'd have access to professional medical oversight, social activities, emergency response, and a support system of other people in similar situations. You'd also have enough money from the house sale to live comfortably for many years without worrying about care costs or household management. But I'd lose my independence. You'd trade some independence for security and professional support. Right now, you're dependent on me for almost everything, but you're pretending you're independent because we don't acknowledge the extent of that dependence. Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring at the storm clouds gathering outside the window. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the wind was starting to pick up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of rain across the desert. "How much time do I have to decide?" "You have until next Friday. That gives you time to visit some facilities, get estimates from care agencies, and talk to David about his willingness to contribute to your care costs." "What if David refuses to help?" "Then you'll need to make decisions based on your own resources and preferences." "And if I can't make any of these arrangements work?" "Then we'll need to discuss involving your doctor and possibly adult protective services to ensure you have appropriate care and oversight." Margaret's breathing became more labored, and she reached for her portable oxygen tank. "You'd really involve outside authorities?" "I'd involve the appropriate professionals to ensure your safety and medical compliance." "Margaret, I'm not going to walk away and leave you in a dangerous situation, but I'm also not going to continue subsidizing an arrangement that's financially destroying me." She attached the oxygen cannula and took several deep breaths before responding. "I understand." The storm broke just as we were finishing our conversation, bringing the first real rain Phoenix had seen in weeks. I helped Margaret get settled for the night, checking her oxygen levels and making sure her medications were properly organized for the next day. She was unusually cooperative and polite, a dramatic change from her typical evening routine of complaints and demands. As I was turning off the lights in the living room, Margaret called out to me from her recliner. "Sarah?" "Yes?" "Thank you for being patient with me today. I know this isn't easy for either of us." "You're welcome, Margaret." "And Sarah?" "Yes?" "I'm going to try to do better with all of this." It wasn't a promise or a commitment, but it was acknowledgement, which was more than I'd expected. I went upstairs to my room and listened to the rain on the roof, while I planned the conversations I'd need to have over the next few days. The next week passed in a strange sort of suspension, like the calm before a monsoon when the air gets heavy and everything feels charged with potential energy. Margaret had begun making serious inquiries about her care options, and I could hear her on the phone for hours each day, speaking with facility administrators and insurance representatives in a tone I'd never heard her use before, respectful, almost humble. David had called twice, both times late at night when he thought I might be more amenable to negotiation. The first call was angry, full of accusations about my selfishness and threats about what he'd tell people about my character. The second call was desperate, pleading with me to reconsider and offering vague promises about making the financial arrangement more equitable in the future. I'd kept both conversations short and documented them carefully in the notebook I'd started keeping. By Thursday, Margaret had narrowed her options down to two possibilities: paying me the professional rate to continue as her live-in caregiver, or moving to Desert Springs Senior Living, a facility about 20 minutes away that had impressed her during her visit earlier in the week. The facility was expensive but comprehensive, offering everything from independent living apartments to skilled nursing care, with the ability to transition between levels of care as her condition progressed. "They have a waiting list," Margaret told me over breakfast, picking at her oatmeal with less enthusiasm than usual. "But the admissions director thinks they might have an opening in their assisted living section within the next month." "What did you think of the facility when you visited?" "It was nicer than I expected. Clean, professional, the staff seemed competent. The other residents I met were..." She paused, searching for the right words. "More like me than I thought they'd be." "What do you mean?" "I mean they weren't just sitting around waiting to die. There was a woman there, Eleanor, who's 83 and still drives herself to her book club meetings. Another woman, Patricia, has been there for 2 years and leads a gardening group. They have activities and social events, but they're not mandatory. People can be as involved or as private as they want to be." "That sounds like it could be a good fit for you." Margaret set down her spoon and looked at me directly. "The monthly cost would be $7,800, not including medical expenses or personal care items." I did the quick calculation. "That's actually less than what you'd pay me for full-time care, and you'd have access to professional medical staff and emergency response." "I know. That's what's surprising me. I expected assisted living to be much more expensive than keeping you here. Professional in-home care is extremely expensive because you're paying for individual attention and the convenience of staying in your own home. Facility care spreads the costs across multiple residents, so it's more economical. The other thing is..." Margaret hesitated, then continued, "They have oxygen concentrators built into each unit. Backup systems, maintenance included in the monthly fee, professional oversight to ensure everything's working properly. I wouldn't have to worry about equipment failures or whether I'm using the equipment correctly." This was the most practical conversation Margaret and I had ever had about her medical needs. That would definitely provide better security than what we have here. And if my condition gets worse, they have higher levels of care available without having to move to a different facility. "You've really thought this through." "I've had to think it through. You made it clear that continuing with our current arrangement isn't sustainable, and you were right." Margaret stood up from the table and walked to the window, her portable oxygen tank trailing behind her on its wheeled cart. The morning light was harsh, the kind of desert brightness that could bleach the color out of everything. But Margaret looked more solid somehow, more present than she had in months. "I want to show you something," she said, returning to the table with a manila folder I hadn't seen before. "I went through all my financial records yesterday, really looked at everything for the first time in years." She opened the folder and spread out bank statements, investment summaries, and insurance documents. "I've been living like I was poor, Sarah. Hoarding money and worrying about expenses while you were paying for everything because I was afraid of spending my savings." I looked at the documents she was showing me and my eyes widened. Margaret had substantially more money than I'd realized. Not just her Social Security and the small pension from her late husband's job, but investment accounts and a life insurance policy that had matured into a significant annuity. "Margaret, these numbers, you could easily afford professional care or a quality assisted living facility." "I know. I've been behaving like someone who couldn't afford groceries, while sitting on enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life." "Why? What were you afraid of?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the bank statements. "I was afraid of not having enough. My mother lived through the Depression, and she used to tell stories about people who lost everything when the banks failed. I think I inherited her fear of spending money, even when spending it would improve my quality of life." "But you were comfortable letting me spend my money." "Yes, and that was wrong. I told myself that you were benefiting from living here, that you were getting something in return for your contributions. But really, I was taking advantage of your sense of obligation and your financial situation. This was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever received from Margaret, and it was more self-aware than I'd expected her to be capable of. What changed your mind about looking at your finances honestly? Talking to the people at Desert Springs. They asked detailed questions about my financial resources and insurance coverage, and I realized I didn't actually know the answers. I'd been letting fear and habit drive my decisions instead of facts. Margaret closed the folder and looked at me seriously. I owe you money, Sarah. A lot of money. You've been covering household expenses that should have been my responsibility, and you've been providing professional-level care without compensation. Margaret, I don't expect you to reimburse me for the past 3 years. Maybe you don't expect it, but it's the right thing to do. She pulled out a piece of paper from the folder. I calculated how much you've spent on household expenses since you moved in here. Mortgage payments, utilities, groceries, medical copays, household maintenance, everything I should have been paying for. I looked at the number she'd written down and felt a little dizzy. $63,000 over 3 years, not including the value of the caregiving services I'd provided. I can't pay you back everything immediately, Margaret continued, but I can pay you back over time, and I can start covering my own expenses going forward. What are you thinking about doing? I'm thinking about moving to Desert Springs. The waiting list isn't as long as they initially told me, and they think they could have a spot available within 2 weeks. I'd sell this house to cover the entrance, fee, and first year's expenses, and I'd use my other resources for ongoing costs. And what about David's loan against the property? Margaret's expression hardened. David's loan will be paid off when the house sells, and he won't be getting any additional money from me. I've been enabling his financial irresponsibility the same way I've been taking advantage of yours. Have you told him about your decision? Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. Make sure you'd be willing to help me with the transition. Of course I'll help you with the transition. What kind of help do you need? Help coordinating with the real estate agent, packing up the house, transferring my medical care to the new facility, that sort of thing. I'd pay you for your time. Of course. Margaret, you don't need to pay me to help you move. That's just basic human decency. After the way I've treated you, basic human decency is more than I deserve. We spent the rest of the morning going through Margaret's medical records and making a list of everything that would need to be coordinated for her move to Desert Springs. The facility had strict requirements for medical documentation and assessment, and Margaret's transition would need to be carefully managed to ensure continuity of her oxygen therapy and medication management. There's one more thing, Margaret said as we were finishing up. I want to pay you for the caregiving work you've been doing, retroactively. It won't be the full professional rate for 3 years, but it will be something that acknowledges the value of what you've provided. Margaret, that's not necessary. It is necessary, for my peace of mind, if nothing else. She pulled out her checkbook and wrote out a check, tearing it off and handing it to me before I could protest. The amount was more than I'd expected, but less than I'd probably earned, and it felt strange to be holding payment for work I'd been doing out of what I'd thought was family obligation. Thank you, I said, not sure what else to say. Thank you for not walking away when you had every reason to. Thank you for forcing me to face the reality of my situation instead of continuing to live in denial. That afternoon, Margaret called David to tell him about her decision. I could hear her side of the conversation from the kitchen, and it was clear that David was not taking the news well. No, David, this isn't a negotiation, Margaret said firmly. I'm selling the house and moving to a care facility. Your loan will be paid off from the proceeds, and that will be the end of our financial arrangement. There was a long pause while David responded. I don't care if it's inconvenient for you. You've been collecting money from this arrangement for 3 years while taking no responsibility for my care. That ends now. Another pause. If you want to be involved in my life going forward, you're welcome to visit me at Desert Springs. But you're not going to continue profiting from my situation while contributing nothing to my well-being." Margaret's voice was stronger and more authoritative than I'd heard it in years. Whatever weakness or uncertainty she'd shown over the past week had been replaced by clear determination. "Sarah will be helping me coordinate the transition, and she'll be involved in any decisions about the house sale and my medical care. If you have concerns about those arrangements, you can discuss them with both of us." I could hear David's voice getting louder through the phone, though I couldn't make out the words. "David, I'm 74 years old with a progressive medical condition. I don't have time to manage your emotions about my practical decisions. You can accept my choice to prioritize my health and safety, or you can continue to live in Seattle and pretend you don't have a mother who needs appropriate care." Margaret hung up the phone and sat quietly for a moment, her breathing slightly labored from the stress of the conversation. "How do you feel?" I asked. "Relieved," she said. "I should have had that conversation 3 years ago." "What did David say about the house sale?" "He threatened to contest the sale, claimed I wasn't competent to make major financial decisions, but he can't actually stop me from selling my own property, and he certainly can't force me to continue an arrangement that isn't in my best interests." "What about his loan?" "He'll get his money back when the house sells, which is more than he deserves given how he's handled this situation." We spent the evening researching real estate agents and discussing the timeline for Margaret's transition to Desert Springs. The facility had confirmed that they could accommodate her within 3 weeks if she could complete the necessary medical assessments and financial arrangements. "I want to list the house immediately," Margaret said. "The sooner we can get it sold, the sooner I can move forward with my new living arrangement." "Are you sure you're ready to leave this house? You've lived here for 40 years. Margaret looked around the living room, taking in the furniture and decorations and photos that represented decades of her life. "I'm ready to stop being afraid of change. This house has become a burden instead of a home, and I can't maintain it safely or afford to modify it appropriately." "What will you do with all your belongings?" "Take what's meaningful and practical to Desert Springs, donate what's useful, and dispose of the rest. I don't need 40 years' worth of accumulation in a new living situation. That's a lot of decision-making and sorting. That's why I'm hoping you'll help me. I can't do it alone, physically or emotionally." "Of course I'll help. But Margaret, this is going to be exhausting and overwhelming at times. Are you prepared for how difficult the process might be?" "I'm more prepared for the difficulty of moving than I am for the difficulty of staying here and continuing to decline in an environment that isn't suitable for my needs." The next morning brought a call from David that I answered while Margaret was in the bathroom. "Sarah, I need you to talk sense into my mother. She's making crazy decisions that she's going to regret." "David, your mother is making practical decisions about her care and living situation based on her actual needs and resources. She's panicking because you threatened to abandon her. This is your fault." "I didn't threaten to abandon her. I explained that our current arrangement wasn't sustainable and that she needed to make appropriate plans for her care. By demanding ridiculous amounts of money for basic help around the house. By explaining the actual cost of the professional medical care and supervision that your mother requires. Mom doesn't need professional medical care. She's just old and needs some assistance. David, your mother has advanced COPD, requires supplemental oxygen therapy, and has medication management needs that require professional oversight. She's not just old, she's medically complex. You're exaggerating her condition to justify charging her more money. I'm accurately describing her condition based on her medical records and her doctor's recommendations. If you think I'm exaggerating, you're welcome to review her medical file or speak with Dr. Rahman directly. I don't need to speak with anyone. I know my mother, and I know she's capable of living independently. When was the last time you spent more than a few hours with your mother, David?" There was a long pause. "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point. You've been absent from your mother's daily life for 3 years, and you have no understanding of what her actual care needs are or what it takes to meet those needs. I've been paying attention to her situation. You've been collecting money from her situation. That's not the same thing as paying attention. Margaret emerged from the bathroom and saw me on the phone with David. She gestured for me to hand her the phone, which I did gladly. David, whatever you're saying to Sarah, you can say to me directly, Margaret said, her voice calm but firm. I could hear David's voice through the phone, agitated and demanding. No, I'm not reconsidering anything. I'm moving to Desert Springs in 3 weeks. The house will be listed for sale next week, and your loan will be paid off from the proceeds. More protests from David. You can visit me anytime you want, but you can't prevent me from making decisions about my own life and property. Margaret listened for a moment, then her expression hardened. David, if you continue to interfere with my care arrangements or attempt to prevent the sale of my house, I'll ask my attorney to send you a cease and desist letter. I won't tolerate harassment from you or anyone else about decisions I have every right to make. She hung up the phone and sat down heavily in her recliner, reaching for her oxygen controls. Are you all right? I asked. I'm angry, but I'm all right. David is behaving like a child who's had his allowance taken away. He's scared about losing the income from the loan arrangement. He should have thought about that before he walked away from his responsibilities. Actions have consequences, and David is about to learn that lesson. The real estate agent, a competent woman named Linda Chen, came by that afternoon to assess the house and discuss pricing strategy. She was professional and knowledgeable, and she didn't seem at all surprised by our situation. I work with a lot of seniors who are transitioning to care facilities, Linda explained. The key is pricing the house to sell quickly while maximizing your return. In this market, with this location and the condition of the property, I think we can have it under contract within 2 weeks. What about David's loan against the property? I asked. That will be paid off at closing from the proceeds, just like any other mortgage. As long as Mrs. Holloway is the legal owner of the property, she has the right to sell it regardless of any loans against it. Margaret signed the listing agreement that afternoon, and Linda promised to have the house on the market by Monday. We spent the weekend sorting through Margaret's belongings, deciding what she'd take to Desert Springs and what could be donated or discarded. I can't believe how much stuff I've accumulated, Margaret said, looking at the boxes we'd filled with items for donation. Most of this I haven't used or even looked at in years. That's normal when you live in the same place for a long time. You accumulate things gradually without realizing how much you have. It feels liberating to get rid of it, like I'm shedding weight I didn't realize I was carrying. We worked methodically through each room, and I was struck by how decisive Margaret had become about what was important to keep and what could be let go. She seemed energized by the process rather than overwhelmed, which surprised me. How are you feeling about the move emotionally? I asked as we were packing up her bedroom, nervous but excited. I haven't felt excited about anything in a long time. What are you most excited about? Not having to worry about maintaining this house anymore. Not having to manage medical equipment and medications on my own. Having other people around who understand what it's like to deal with health issues and aging. What are you most nervous about? Whether I'll fit in, whether I'll like the food, whether I'll be able to maintain my independence in a more structured environment. Those are reasonable concerns. You can always visit again before you make the final decision. I've already made the final decision. The concerns are just details to work through. By Sunday evening, we'd packed everything Margaret wanted to take to Desert Springs and arranged for donation pickup for everything else. The house felt empty and echoing, like a stage set after the actors had left. Any regrets? I asked as we sat in the living room surrounded by boxes. About selling the house? No. About taking so long to make this decision? Yes. What do you mean? I mean, I could have made this transition 2 years ago and saved both of us a lot of stress and difficulty. Instead, I held on to an arrangement that wasn't working because I was afraid of change. Change is difficult at any age, but especially when you're dealing with health issues. Change is difficult, but stagnation is worse. I've been stagnating for years, pretending that if I didn't acknowledge the progression of my condition, it wouldn't progress. And now I'm ready to live with my condition instead of in spite of it. Monday morning brought the first showing of the house, and by Tuesday afternoon we had 2 serious offers. Linda called with the news while Margaret was at her pre-admission appointment at Desert Springs. Both offers are very close to the asking price, Linda reported. One is from a cash buyer who can close in 2 weeks, and the other is from a family with financing pre-approval who can close in 3 weeks. Which offer would you recommend? The cash offer. It's slightly lower, but it's more certain and faster, which gives Mrs. Holloway more flexibility with her move-in timing at Desert Springs. Margaret agreed to accept the cash offer when she returned from her appointment, which had gone better than expected. "They're moving my admission date up," she told me excitedly. "They had a cancellation, so I can move in this Friday if I want to." "This Friday? That's only 4 days away." "I know, but everything else is falling into place so quickly. The house will be sold, my medical records have been transferred, and my financial arrangements are complete. Why wait?" "Are you sure you're ready?" "I'm more than ready. I'm eager." The next few days passed in a blur of final preparations. Margaret's oxygen equipment was delivered to Desert Springs and set up in her new apartment. Her medications were transferred to the facility's pharmacy. Her medical care was coordinated with the on-site nursing staff. Box by box, her belongings were moved to her new home. On Friday morning, as we were loading the last of Margaret's personal items into my car, David arrived unannounced. "Mom, you can't do this," he said, getting out of a rental car and approaching us with determination. "You're making a huge mistake." "David, what are you doing here?" Margaret asked, not sounding pleased to see him. "I'm here to stop you from ruining your life. You don't need to move to some institution. We can work out the problems with the current arrangement." "The current arrangement is ending today, David. I'm moving to Desert Springs this afternoon because Sarah has been manipulating you into thinking you don't have other options. Sarah has been helping me understand what my actual options are and what each option costs. Something you should have been doing for the past 3 years. I've been supporting you financially. You've been collecting rent from me while contributing nothing to my actual care or well-being." David looked around at the boxes and the moving truck, finally seeming to understand that this wasn't a negotiation or a temporary decision. "How much is this place going to cost you?" "Less than it would cost to hire professional in-home care, and more than I was spending when Sarah was subsidizing my lifestyle. What if you don't like it there?" "Then I'll move somewhere else. But I'm not staying here, and I'm not continuing an arrangement that requires other people to sacrifice their financial security for my comfort." David turned to me, his expression hostile. "This is what you wanted all along, isn't it? To force Mom out of her own house so you don't have to take care of her anymore." "David, I wanted a sustainable arrangement that didn't require me to pay for the privilege of providing care for your mother. Your mother decided that moving to a care facility was the best way to achieve that sustainability. You could have just asked for help instead of threatening to abandon her." "I did ask for help, multiple times over 3 years. You made it clear that your lifestyle in Seattle was more important than your mother's care needs." "I was sending money." "You were collecting money from the loan payments I was making on your mother's house." David's face flushed red. "Those were legitimate loan payments on a properly executed financial agreement. Those were rent payments disguised as mortgage payments, and you know it." Margaret had been listening to this exchange with increasing impatience. "David, I'm leaving for Desert Springs in 2 hours." You can spend that time arguing about arrangements that are already finalized, or you can help me finish loading my belongings and drive over to see my new apartment. Mom, please reconsider. We can make the current situation work. The current situation never worked, David. It only appeared to work because Sarah was sacrificing her own financial stability to maintain it. So change the financial arrangements. Pay Sarah more, give her a stake in the house, whatever. It takes. What it takes is professional medical oversight, safety modifications to this house, and ongoing care coordination that costs more than I'd pay at Desert Springs. Even if I could afford it, I don't want to continue living in isolation and decline when I have better options available. David stared at his mother for a long moment, and I could see him finally understanding that her decision wasn't about money or convenience or manipulation. It was about choosing a better quality of life, while she still had the capacity to make that choice. Can I see the place before you move in? Of course. I'd like you to see it. We finished loading Margaret's belongings and made the drive to Desert Springs in convoy, David following behind us in his rental car. The facility was impressive, more like a resort hotel than an institutional care facility, with well-maintained grounds and an atmosphere of activity and engagement. Margaret's apartment was on the second floor with a view of the mountains, and it had been set up with her furniture and personal belongings in a way that felt homey and familiar. Her oxygen concentrator was positioned perfectly beside her favorite chair, and her medications were already organized in the facility's system. "This is actually really nice," David admitted, looking around the apartment and out at the view. "It's better than nice. It's exactly what I need." A knock on the door introduced us to Patricia, Margaret's next-door neighbor and the woman who led the gardening group Margaret had mentioned. "Welcome to Desert Springs," Patricia said warmly. "I brought you some cookies from our baking group, and I wanted to invite you to join us for dinner tonight if you're feeling up to it." "I'd love that," Margaret said, and I could see her already beginning to relax into her new environment. David stayed for dinner, and I could see him observing the other residents and the staff, taking in the professional but friendly atmosphere, the quality of the food, and the genuine sense of community that existed in the facility. "I owe you an apology," he said to me as we were leaving. "I didn't understand what Mom's situation really was, and I didn't understand what you'd been doing to help her." "Thank you for saying that. I also owe you money for everything you've covered over the past 3 years. Your mother has already taken care of that. Not just the household expenses. For the caregiving work, Mom told me what professional care costs, and what you were providing was worth a lot more than we acknowledged. David, I appreciate the sentiment, but I don't need anything from you. Your mother and I have settled our accounts. What will you do now?" I looked around at Margaret's new apartment, at her settling into a community where she'd have professional support and social connections, at David finally beginning to understand his mother's actual needs. "I'm going to live my own life for the first time in 3 years." That night, I went back to Margaret's old house to collect my own belongings and clean up the final details of the move. The house was empty now, except for my things, echoing and strange without Margaret's oxygen concentrator humming in the background. I sat in the living room where I'd spent so many evenings listening to Margaret's complaints and managing her medications, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Not just freedom from the financial burden or the daily stress of caregiving, but freedom from the obligation to accept arrangements that weren't fair or sustainable just because other people expected me to. Margaret had given me a check for $25,000 as partial compensation for the caregiving work I'd provided, along with full reimbursement for the household expenses I'd covered. It wasn't enough to make up for 3 years of financial sacrifice, but it was enough to give me options I hadn't had before. More importantly, it was acknowledgement, recognition that what I'd provided had value, and that the arrangement we'd had wasn't sustainable or fair, and that change had been necessary for both of us. I packed my belongings and loaded them into my car, taking one last look around the house that had been my home for 3 years but had never really belonged to me. Tomorrow, I'd start looking for my own place, something small and manageable that I could afford without subsidizing anyone else's lifestyle. Margaret called as I was driving away. "Sarah, I just wanted to thank you again for everything you've done to help me make this transition. How are you feeling about your first night at Desert Springs?" "Good. Actually, really good. Patricia introduced me to several other residents, and we had a very nice dinner together. The staff has been wonderful, and my oxygen equipment is working perfectly." "I'm so glad to hear that. I also wanted you to know that the house sold today. Linda called with the final paperwork, and the closing is scheduled for next week." "That's wonderful news." "It is. And Sarah?" "Yes?" "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what our arrangement was costing you. I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to choose between taking care of me and taking care of yourself." "Thank you for saying that, Margaret. It means a lot. I hope you'll come visit me once I'm settled." "I'd like that." As I drove through the Phoenix night toward whatever came next, I thought about the difference between being needed and being valued, between sacrifice and service, between obligation and choice. For 3 years, I'd been needed desperately, but valued barely at all. Now, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I had the opportunity to choose what I wanted to do with my time and energy and resources. It felt like breathing freely after years of holding my breath. Like Margaret with her oxygen concentrator, I'd been dependent on a system that wasn't sustainable, and now I was finally free to find something better. The night air coming through my car windows smelled like rain and possibility, and for the first time in years, I was excited about what tomorrow might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.